Hello, these are flipped notes 2-6, and we are learning about brain regions. My Bitmoji there, all into the brains. So, in this section, we're really dividing up the cerebral cortex. So, we know from our last section that the cortex is the whole outer layer of the brain. It includes the cerebrum. And we know that that's where a lot of our higher level thinking and processing happens. But we can divide it into four main regions, the four different lobes of the brain. Remember, this is just the one hemisphere. It's actually the right hemisphere of the brain. So for each of these lobes, you actually have two. So you really have two hemispheres and eight lobes of the brain. In the front, we've got our frontal lobe. Makes sense, it's in the front. In the back, we've got the occipital lobe. In the top, the parietal lobe. And then on the sides, of both sides, we've got the temporal lobe. Back here, hopefully you recognize this is your cerebellum. Underneath that, the hindbrain and the brainstem and our spinal cord going down. So let's look at what each part does. So the frontal lobe, like it says, sounds, is behind the forehead at the front of the brain, and that includes another region at the very front called the prefrontal cortex, which we'll show on the next slide. Frontal lobe has a lot of really important jobs. It is helping you to make decisions, so judgment, planning for the future, producing speech sounds. So Broca's area is in the left frontal lobe. We'll talk about that later in this section. Helping to control emotions. So it's linked to the limbic system. Personality seems to be processed here in the frontal lobe. And then movement is processed at the back of the frontal lobe in the motor cortex. And one of the weird things about the frontal lobe, it is not fully connected and fully developed until your early 20s. So, all of you teenagers, your frontal lobe is not fully connected, which means all these things that we just listed here, specifically judgment and making decisions, being able to control your emotions, those are things that are still developing for you. It probably makes a lot of sense. And we'll talk about that some more in class. So I've got a few mnemonics in this section as well. So my mnemonic for the frontal lobe is that a student at the front of the class is the type of student that you picture who does lots of planning, is organized, judgments, makes good judgments, sets goals, they're ready to speak. And those are all things that the frontal lobe can do for you. So the student at the front of the class can do all the same things as the frontal lobe. Here we mentioned already that the prefrontal cortex is at the very front. So the most high level decision making, problem solving, emotion, and complex thoughts happens at the very front of the frontal lobe. Emotional responses, behavior, and judgment. And again, that stuff is not fully developed until your early to mid 20s. The next area of the cortex is not a lobe, but it's located at the back of the frontal lobe, and that is the motor cortex. In this diagram, it's the blue area. It says primary motor cortex in there. So located at the back of the frontal lobe, and it mostly does voluntary movements of different parts of the body. If we were to actually stimulate, like touch electrically, a part of the motor cortex, a different part of the body would move depending where specifically we touched on the motor cortex. In the diagram here to the side, let me move my image. We can see which parts of the brain are lighting up where where the motor cortex is being accessed. So down here, we've got lots of cortex area for the tongue because our tongue moves so much when we're talking, when we're eating, just anytime. The lips have a lot of movement. The fingers, that red area. So generally, the more area or the more variety in movements, the more motor cortex area that gets. My mnemonic for this one, motor cortex, I feel like is pretty easy to remember anyway, because motor just means movement. So motor cortex, the Texas Motor Cortex Speedway, there's lots of movement going on out there at the racetrack. So motor cortex equals voluntary movement. All right, this funny looking guy, his name is homunculus. So what he is if we were to make a human or a model whose body parts were proportionate to the amount of cortex space in the brain that is dedicated to those body parts, this is what we would look like. So because our hands are so sensitive, we get a lot of cortex space in the brain for our hands. So they appear really big here. He's got super sensitive hands. The lips, the tongue, our ears, really our entire face is very sensitive. And a lot of cortex space in the brain are dedicated to those enlarged parts on his body. Whereas the parts that are really small, which is pretty much his whole torso, his arms, and his legs, they're actually not very sensitive and there's not a wide variety of movement. So they don't get very much cortex space. I have another diagram of this here without kind of the freaky looking guy. But looking at our face, the tongue for swallowing, the motor cortex gives a lot of area to those parts of the body. So motor cortex, parts of the body that have more variety in movement get more motor cortex space. On this one, looking at how much space is dedicated to different parts of the body for the senses, the sensory cortex, our most sensitive parts of the body include our face and our mouth, our tongue, but the rest of our body is not nearly as sensitive. They don't get as much sensory cortex space. All right, our next lobe of the brain is located at the top, and this is the parietal lobe. And it includes the somatosensory cortex. And the main thing to remember about the parietal lobe is it's all about touch sensations. It does help process body position, pressure, temperature, pain, but all of that ties into touch. So, parietal lobe, touch sensations. The sensory cortex or the somatosensory cortex is included in the, let me go back to the other diagram and see if it showed it on there. Here it is at the front of the parietal lobe. Here's our somatosensory cortex. Largely responsible for perceiving touch and pressure on parts of the body. If we were to actually be able to literally touch and stimulate the sensory cortex, you would feel pressure to some corresponding part of the body. So they've actually done experiments with that where they have somebody's head open and they stimulate different parts of the sensory cortex and ask them, what did you feel? And people would report, I felt pressure in my fingers. I felt pressure in my shoulder. So the cortex, every single spot on the body corresponds to a part of the sensory cortex. In the diagram here, it's an fMRI image of the brain experiencing pain. And remember, an fMRI is showing blood flow throughout the brain when things are being done. So in this case, they're experiencing pain. So this green area are the sensory areas. So showing how much of the brain lights up with pain, definitely lights up in that sensory area. Another area that lights up is the area in red, and that's indicating areas for the emotional experiences of pain. So the hippocampus is included in there. The hypothalamus and the amygdala, all of that are kind of tied in here as all parts of processing pain. Our next region of the brain is the occipital lobe, which is located at the very back of the brain. So visual areas or visual information is going to go to the opposite visual field. So if we're seeing something with our left eye, it's going to go to the right occipital lobe. Seeing something in our right field of vision, going to go to the left occipital lobe. It includes the primary visual cortex, and everything that's going to the visual cortex corresponds with a specific spot on the retina, which are the cells in your eye, which is in another chapter. My mnemonic for the occipital lobe is usually just anything related to optical. I got my eye on you, but occipital or occipital, like occipital, I see you. Anyways, all of those tie into the occipital lobe. Our next one is the temporal lobe, and it's green on our diagram here. It's located above the ears, or really like right by your temples on the sides of your forehead. And the main thing we want to remember here is this is where auditory things are processed. So it's all about hearing. Does include areas where we store long-term memories, speech and language, and understanding language. But for the temporal lobe, we want to think hearing. My mnemonic for this one is you can hear the tempo of the music, the tempo, the rhythm, the beat, tempo, temporal lobe. So some more areas of the cortex, and a lot of these you'll see on your list of brain parts that you need to know. And we have a kind of two for everything here. So we have a primary motor cortex and we have a motor association cortex. So these primary ones and these ones that are kind of on the left here, these are just simple initiation of movement, initiation of the senses, just kind of simple processing. Anything that has association in its name here, like the motor association cortex, this is going to be combining multiple movements. So lots of things going on, higher order associations, higher order thinking. So primary somatosensory cortex would be a simple touch. Sensory association area is going to be lots of touch sensations going on at one time. Visual cortex would be a simple image. Visual association area would be combining lots of images or trying to maybe like scan a crowd and look for a person in the crowd or looking at a Where's Waldo book. And then the auditory cortex, again, like initiating the processing of sound. Auditory association area would be like listening to a symphony and trying to pick out the cellos. So again, anything with the association areas, you're going to think complex processing. Any of the just primary stuff, just simple processing. All right, now looking at language processing, we know that language is in the left side of the brain. So our person is over here looking to the left. This is a left hemisphere. We've got 5 main areas that are involved in language processing. The visual cortex, if we're actually reading language, this is receiving the written word, and this is here in the occipital lobe. The angular gyrus, when you're reading something, especially if you're like reading it silently, it converts it to an auditory code. So when you're reading something and it's like you hear it in your head while you're reading, that's the angular gyrus, this blue area. Also part of the occipital lobe because it's part of vision. The next one, number 3, it looks like Wernicke's, but the correct pronunciation is Wernicke's area. This is one of those German words. W makes a V sound. Wernicke's area is what helps us to understand language, interprets auditory code, and that's in the temporal lobe, which we know temporal lobe is all about hearing. The next one is Broca's area, and it is in the frontal lobe by the motor cortex. And this is actually what helps us to speak. It's helping us to move all the muscles involved in speaking language. And then the motor cortex also plays a role in language, and that helps us with where the word is pronounced. So what happens when language doesn't work? When language isn't working, we call that aphasia, when there's impaired use of language due to damage to one or more parts of the cortex. So you could have Broca's aphasia or you could have Wernicke's aphasia. So Broca's area, again, is what controls the speech muscles via the motor cortex. So in the left frontal lobe there, Broca's area is what helps you to talk. So my mnemonic for Broca's area, if your jaw is a Broca, you can't do any talka. Get it? You can't talk if your jaw is broke. So Broca's area is literally what helps you to move your jaw, all the muscles involved in speaking, but also helps to contract and release the muscles in your throat, muscles to move your tongue, everything involved, helping to move airflow while you speak, lots of stuff going on, and it's Broca's area that processes that. People who have Broca's aphasia can think just fine and they know what they want to say, but they literally cannot articulate their words. We'll watch some video of this. Wernicke's area is what understands language. So as I'm talking to you, your Wernicke's area is hearing and understanding the words that I'm saying. And this is in the left temporal lobe. So remember, left side language, temporal lobe is hearing. So Wernicke's area is in that left temporal lobe. Usually you just need to remember that it's on the left side, but you're a pro if you can remember that it's in the temporal lobe. So if Wernicke's area wasn't working, I would sound like wah, 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 wah. So, and I always think that sounds like what the teacher sounds like in Charlie Brown. So a malfunctioning Wernicke's sounds like wah, 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 wah. Now, that mnemonic really goes with, okay, so when I first learned this, I thought Wernicke's was Wernicke's. So I would say Wernicke's, wah, 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 wah. But it's actually Wernicke's. But I still think Wernicke's, wah, 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 wah. All right, y'all don't turn me into a meme with all those funny sounds. All right, the other 2 areas involved in language in the brain, the angular gyrus for visual representations of auditory code, and the visual cortex helping us to see written words. Some PET scans here showing language processing. So Wernicke's area, again, is what helps us to understand language. So that's lit up right here in the left temporal lobe. Seeing words with the angular gyrus. Remember, the occipital lobe in the back is for vision, so that's lighting up. And then speaking words using Broca's area and the motor cortex. Broca's area is over here in the left frontal lobe, and the motor cortex right here about where that line is. And then our last region of the brain we'll talk about is really kind of the opposite of a region. This is the empty areas of the brain, and that is the ventricular system. So the brain ventricles are the hollow cavities or the hollow areas of the brain, though they're not even actually hollow. They're filled with cerebral spinal fluid. So I guess they are hollow, but they're filled with fluid. Cerebral spinal fluid provides cushion for the brain. It's really important. Helps kind of provide nutrition for the brain. So it is an important part. We don't go into a whole lot of detail other than just saying what it is. A strange abnormality about the brain ventricles is that people who are schizophrenic tend to have enlarged ventricles. So we've got a pair of twin MRIs here, and the normal twin has pretty small ventricles right here. But on the twin with schizophrenia, you can see how much larger they are. So we wouldn't say that the enlarged ventricles are a cause of schizophrenia, more like they seem to be a side effect. And kind of the effect of that is that there's just less overall brain matter for processing information. So enlarged ventricles common in schizophrenic patients. All right, that is it for flipped notes 2-6. Oh, I can end it.